This video discusses psychological patterns drawn from clinical research. It is not a substitute for therapy. If anything you hear today resonates deeply, take it as an invitation to explore, not a diagnosis. Psychology of women who know how to fix everything. There's a woman who, when something breaks in her house, doesn't call a repairman first. She doesn't text her husband. She doesn't post in the neighborhood Facebook group asking for recommendations. She watches a YouTube video, walks to her garage, finds the right tool, and 3 hours later, the dishwasher works again. Nobody throws a parade. Nobody really notices, and she's not surprised, because nobody ever has. If that woman sounds familiar, if she sounds like you or your mother, or that one friend everyone calls when their life falls apart, stay with me, because this isn't another article about how women do too much. By the end of this video, you're going to know exactly which pattern of fixing is yours, where it came from, and the one specific shift that begins to undo it. 3 names from clinical research. 1 question your therapist would ask if you ever sat down long enough to see one, and 1 permission you've probably been waiting decades to hear. Let's go. Let me describe her because I think you already know her. She's the one who handles a call from the school nurse during a 2 p.m. meeting and doesn't miss a beat. She knows which medications her mother takes in the morning, which ones at night, and which one her mom keeps forgetting to refill. She's the one in the office who somehow knows how to reset the network when IT is 2 hours away. She's the one her sister calls at 11 p.m. when the marriage is falling apart, again. She's the one everyone calls. She is not the one anyone calls about. There's a particular look that comes over women like this. When someone asks, "How are you really doing?" It's not sadness. It's not surprise. It's something more like confusion. As if the question doesn't quite compute. As if no one has asked it in so long that the answer has gone somewhere she can't easily reach. If something just tightened in your chest, keep listening. There's a reason you became this way. And it's not the reason you've been told. I want to pause and say something honest, because I'm not describing this from a textbook. For most of my 30s, I was this woman. And the day I realized what it was costing me, I was sitting in my car in a grocery store parking lot, having cried for 10 minutes about something that wasn't even a real problem. And what I had to admit, sitting there, was that the problem wasn't the thing I was crying about. The problem was that I had no one to call. Not because I didn't have people. I had wonderful people. The problem was that I had taught everyone in my life, including myself, that I didn't need them. So if any of this is hitting close to home, I'm not on the outside of this. I'm on the inside of it with you. Let me show you what I learned. Most people see a woman who fixes everything and call it strength, capability, independence. She just handles things, they say, like it's a gift. But there's a different word for it one clinicians have been using for the last decade: hyperindependence. Here's what's important. Hyperindependence is not a personality trait. It's not a character strength. Trauma-informed therapists classify it as a survival response, one that develops in environments where a child learned, through repetition, that asking for help didn't work, or worse, that asking for help made things harder. In 1954, a psychologist named Julian Rotter introduced a concept called internal locus of control, the belief that what happens in your life is mostly determined by your own actions, not by other people, not by chance. Decades of research show this belief is, in many ways, protective. People with it persist longer at problems. They recover from setbacks faster. But there's a version of internal locus of control that doesn't develop because life rewarded effort. It develops because life punished dependence. The child who reaches out and finds nobody home literally or emotionally doesn't have the luxury of a balanced view. She doesn't get to learn that sometimes you ask and someone helps. She learns one rule, absolutely. If I don't handle this, no one will. That's not a belief. That's an operating system. And here's the question good therapists ask. After enough trust has been built, the question almost no one else will ever ask you. When did you first learn that no one was coming? Slow down with me here, because what I'm about to describe isn't universal. Every woman's story is her own. But if any of this resonates, receive it gently. It might have been bigger than you realize, or smaller than you'd expect. It might have been the divorce, or the year your mom went back to work, or the parent who was physically there but emotionally somewhere else. Or it might have been something almost invisible, like the day you scraped your knee badly enough to cry and someone in your house who loved you said you're fine, and you weren't fine. But you understood in that moment that fine was the answer that worked, so you started giving it. By age 10, you were fluent in fine. You learned a lesson on those days, and the lesson didn't come in words. It came in your body. Your nervous system absorbed it before your conscious mind could articulate what was happening. The lesson was simple. I'd better learn to handle this. And here's something almost no one says out loud, so I'll say it. You have the right to be angry about that. Not at any one person. Most of them couldn't have done better than they did. They were the children of people who survived wars and recessions and immigrations. Stoicism wasn't their flaw. It was their inheritance. But inheritances don't ask if we want them. You're allowed to be angry at the situation itself, at the version of childhood where the lesson was no one is coming, at what it cost you. You don't have to pretty it up into "it made me strong." Sometimes it just made you tired and lonely and 8 years old still. The little girl who learned to handle it grew up. She got extraordinary at handling it. So extraordinary that nobody, including her, could see what she was paying. The language we usually use, burnout, self-care, work-life balance, is too small for what's actually happening. So let me walk you through what hyperindependence really costs. The first cost is that her ability to receive help becomes neurologically dampened. Picture this simple diagram. Box 1. Stressor. Something breaks. Someone needs something. Box 2. Nervous system assessment. Box 3A. Ask for help. Reach out, accept support. Or, Box 3B, handle it alone, self-reliance. For most people, the assessment in the middle box runs both pathways and picks the appropriate one. For a woman with hyperindependence, the pathway to ask for help got pruned a long time ago, through repetition. Through the 1,000 small moments where reaching out either didn't work or actively backfired. So now, when something breaks, her nervous system doesn't even run the calculation. Box 3B lights up automatically. The words come out of her mouth before she thinks them. No, I've got it. Even when she doesn't. Even when she's drowning. The second cost is that every relationship becomes asymmetric. She becomes the one friends call when their life is in pieces. Almost no one calls when life is fine. Her relationships become a slow, one-way river flowing toward her, rarely flowing back. Over time, she stops noticing. She might even prefer it. Being needed is familiar. Being wanted, just for being there, feels suspicious, like a setup for disappointment. There is a third cost, and this one is the deepest. It's the one that, once you see it, you can't unsee. I'm going to come back to it. But first, I need to give you something to hold on to. Because once you understand the third cost, you'll need a way out. And there is one. Here's what I want you to hear, and hear carefully. The goal is not to stop being capable. The world needs women who can hold complexity. That's not the problem. The problem is when capability becomes the only thing you're allowed to be. Family systems therapists, going back to Murray Bowen in the 1960s, use a word for what comes next: differentiation. The capacity to stay yourself in the middle of other people's needs, not to dissolve into them, not to wall yourself off, to remain a separate person while still showing up. I'm going to give you 3 small shifts. They're not life hacks. They will not fix this in a weekend, but they're where the rewiring actually begins. Shift 1, and let's start with something almost embarrassingly small. 2 seconds. The next time someone's crisis lands in your lap, and it will, probably today before you start solving, pause. Just one breath. Notice that you noticed. That tiny gap between perception and automatic action is neurologically where new pathways get built. Albert Bandura's research on self-efficacy from 1977 showed that change doesn't come from massive overhauls. It comes from what he called mastery experiences, small, repeated successes that, over time, rewire what your nervous system believes is possible. A 2-second pause is a mastery experience. Don't underestimate it. Shift 2, and okay, real talk between us. The first time you ask for help, you will sound terrible. You'll over-explain. You'll apologize. You'll add 3 caveats about how you don't really need it, but if it's not too much trouble, do it anyway. Not because you can't handle it alone. You've already proven exhaustively that you can. Do it because your nervous system needs to learn slowly, with great patience, that the world does not punish you for needing things. That belief was installed wrongly. It can be installed again, but only through experience, not through insight, not through this video. Through the awkward, glass-swallowing act of reaching out anyway. Shift 3 is the hardest, and I'm going to ask you to do something that might feel almost illegal. Be useless on purpose. There's a version of you who isn't fixing anything, who's sitting on a couch on a Sunday afternoon, doing nothing productive, not even a little bit, and isn't apologizing for it. That version of you is allowed to exist. She's been waiting. Sit with her for 15 minutes, then 30, then an hour. Brené Brown's research on shame and worthiness has been pointing at this for 2 decades, that the belief I am worthy because I produce is itself the wound. The only way out is the slow, terrifying practice of being valuable without earning it. I'll tell you honestly, I've been doing this work for years, and I still feel the pull. Last weekend, I sat down to read a novel, and within 10 minutes, I had reorganized 2 drawers and answered 3 emails. Old wiring is patient. It waits. The point is not to never do this again. The point is to start to notice. Okay, the third cost. There's a quiet question that lives underneath all of this, and most women who fix everything have never asked it out loud. The question is, if I stopped being useful, would anyone still want me here? That question, that exact question, is what the practice of differentiation slowly answers, not by giving you a logical reply, by giving you, over months and years of small moments, the lived experience of being received without producing, of being cared for without performing, of mattering without earning it. And here's why this matters more than just personally. The woman who fixes everything didn't invent herself in a vacuum. She was raised in a country that promised women they could have it all without ever building the infrastructure to make that promise honest. Childcare costs more than rent. Paid family leave barely exists. Workplace culture was designed during decades when it was assumed someone else was at home managing the rest of life. When women entered those workplaces in large numbers, the workplaces did not change. The expectation simply doubled. She was told she could be anything, and then she was handed everything. If you've been carrying more than you should, and if you're still listening, I suspect you have been, it isn't because you're doing something wrong. It's because the system was constructed assuming someone like you would carry it. And you did. Often beautifully, always at a cost that no one tallied. The question now is not whether you can keep doing it. You've already proven, beyond any reasonable doubt, that you can. The question is whether you want to. At the beginning of this video, I described a woman. The one who, when something breaks, walks to her garage and figures it out. Who has been the person who handles things for so long that she barely remembers being any other kind of person? I want to say something to her now. If she's still listening, you are extraordinary. That part is real. Your competence is not a costume, it's not performance, it is genuine, hard-won, and it has held up worlds that would have collapsed without you. Don't let anyone, including yourself, talk you out of that. But you are also tired, in a deep place. A place you don't even let yourself look at most days, because looking at it might break something you can't afford to have break right now. So here is what I want you to consider. Not as advice, as a possibility you are allowed to entertain. You were never the dishwasher. You were never the broken thing that needed fixing. You were always the one keeping everything else from breaking. And it is possible, genuinely possible, that you have earned the right to want a life where you are not the strong one all the time, where capability is one thing you have, but not the only thing you are, where someone occasionally asks how you are doing and waits long enough for you to find the real answer. You don't have to keep proving you can hold it. You're allowed to set it down, not because you've failed, because you've earned 10 times over the right to want something different than what you've been given. If that's you, you were seen here.